Welcome to this episode of Hope Ropes. This time, I'm going to share my story. And I know I've shared it a lot on other people's podcasts, but I've never really shared it on my terms. And so that's what this is going to be. This is going to be part one of my story, a three-part series, which will combine my healing journey from chronic illness, my spiritual journey from the New Age to Jesus, and my NDE. So stay tuned. Now, this particular session will be about my chronic illness journey and my recovery. And I'm going to start by giving you some context, going way back. Now, this is not an exhaustive account. I mean, there's going to be things that I've missed, and I've compiled a little list to kind of keep me on track, but I think it's important to understand how I got to where I was. So, for those of you who don't know me, I am Vanessa, your grateful guide. I spent a decade of my life with debilitating chronic illness, 50 diagnoses, close to 100 different symptoms, and just a life, like it felt like a lifetime of absolute hell. And I recovered. I got my life back. And it was all through this mind body work and, of course, my faith. So I cannot separate mind, body, and spirit. It is all part of this whole journey for myself. And I really call this my journey from survival to safety because I know it was this chronic survival that got me to this place of debilitating chronic illness to my deathbed. And so this is my story of survival. Now, just make yourself comfortable, listen with an open heart and mind. You might relate to some of these things, and I encourage you to be curious as to what sticks out to you. Maybe you had some of the same childhood experiences as I did, maybe the same symptoms. It's not to say that all our journeys are the same, but many of us share some of the qualities and survival patterns, survival stories that get us to where we are. So I'm going to start by going way back. This is not a full biography by any means. This is really just some of the pivotal moments that can paint this picture of survival. Now, I grew up with just the most loving parents, and I know how lucky I am. Trust me, I do. And I was blessed with love, really had community support. As a Greek growing up in Canada, we came here, immigrated, my parents to Canada, my grandparents, and we built a life for ourselves here. Now, I was born in Canada and surrounded by a village in here in Toronto, lots of support, lots of family, relatives, connection. And so that, on its own paints this picture of, oh, okay, she grew up with love, with support, and so she should be okay. But even though I grew up with that beautiful support, I still ended up in survival. So going back to even being in the womb of my mom, I know that she experienced a traumatic loss and that really, really affected her during her pregnancy. So we can already see this initial onset of this survival energy that was in me through my mother in the womb. Now, as a child, we moved to Greece and lived in Athens in a really cramped apartment with other family members. And I was also exposed to some not so nurturing behavior and experiences from extended family. And so I was already in a fear state, really terrified of a particular individual who did not feel safe to me. We found out down the line after the fact that there were some episodes of just, physical abuse. If I would cry, if I would whine, that sort of stuff. So that already starts planting these seeds, right? Now, this evolved into us moving again back to Canada, again, readjusting to life here. And I had a lot of anxious attachment, especially with my mom. I didn't want to be without her. She felt very safe to me. I needed her there, and I would have multiple experiences of panic, anxiety, even from a really young girl. And at the age around 5, we had a sudden traumatic loss of my grandfather in Greece. And so that was my first experience of true grief. I saw these most strongest people in my life, my mom and my dad, completely crumble under the weight of this sudden traumatic loss. And this was kind of the beginning of emotional repression as well for me. Now, my parents were going through devastation, and so was my grandmother. And me and my brother were told to just be good kids, be nice, be quiet. So there was already this concept growing in my mind that if I was quiet, then everybody would be okay. If I was quiet, my parents would be happy. If I didn't whine or didn't cry, my parents would be happy. Now, I conceptualize this as best I could with a 5, 6-year-old brain. And I still remember it vividly, these moments where all of these people were gathered in my grandparents' home in Greece, mourning, crying, wailing. And this was really scary for a 5-year-old. I was hiding under the dining room table, trying to play with some of the toys that I had. And no one even noticed I was there. I felt very alone. I didn't even know what was happening. No one would tell me. No one even told me how he passed away or even that he did. In a sense, there was no direct conversation, which I understand everyone was trying to do the best that they could. But that was my first experience with grief, which also triggered my fear of death. And so as the years went on, I had multiple experiences, and I guess you can call them, physical traumas with surgeries. I had a umbilical hernia. This is all like around grade 1. So I'm young at this point, grade 2. I had a tonsillectomy. I experienced a bowel obstruction. I had a massive growth behind my left knee that needed invasive surgery, and I was on crutches for months. All of these hospital visits, hospital stays, experiences with my body feeling very unsafe. I had experiences where I had panic attacks and fear and OCD started to develop, where I would wash my hands obsessively because I was afraid I would catch something and I would die. And then I would have religious OCD from back then where I would have to say the right thing or do the right thing and, you know, uh, touch certain religious icons exactly this amount of time. If I didn't do it right, then God was going to take someone away from my life, and almost this belief, this concept that it was up to me to save everyone. And so that's a lot of pressure to put on a little kid. And none of this was spoken to me. Again, all of these formed through probably confusion around what was going on in my life and my own little, really, really scared, brain trying to make sense of everything. I was bullied as a child. I was the weird girl. I was the ugly girl. I didn't fit in anywhere. I always felt that. I, again, was in survival because I feared being bullied. I was not only bullied with words, I was physically bullied as well. And so this put me into this response where I had to always be hyper vigilant, scanning my environment for threat. And the threat was real. And it put me into this chronic survival state so I could stay alive. As I progressed and got to junior high, high school, I never felt good enough. I, again, was not the prettiest girl. I had really unconventional hobbies and interests, and I was just different. And again, I see it now as a strength, but back then it was adding to the threat. So I never felt good enough, and again was bullied very, very, very badly in high school. And there was this knowing that in order to survive, I had to get them to like me in some way. Like that was a necessity. And so I began people pleasing. I turned into a chameleon. I started to become what everybody else wanted me to be. I couldn't be different. Different was not safe. And so that also began this obsession with what others think of me, having to always please them, to be safe, making sure I was almost like on pins and needles all the time, making sure I didn't say the wrong thing. And I would have to really manage everyone else's expectations. And I also developed multiple eating disorders. So bulimia, anorexia. I was obsessed with exercising and it eventually turned into orthorexia as well. But again, this belief that it was not good enough and it wasn't safe to not be good enough. And this really was also, in a way, this attempt to gain control over my life. If I was skinnier, then maybe they like me. If I was prettier, they'd like me. It all boiled down to if they could accept me, then I would be safe. But I never accepted myself. And so I would always, always keep pushing to try and be better and better and better. Migraines really started in my teens as well. There was just an immense amount of stress, pressure that I was putting on myself to be what everyone expected me to be. And again, never getting these messages from my parents ever. So I had that steady home base. And yet this culminated in a relationship with someone who was older than me, one of my first relationships. And I was very vulnerable. I was young. I was put into a situation which I shouldn't have been put into. And it was because for the first time, someone showed interest in me. Someone told me I was beautiful, and that met a need. That relationship was abusive emotionally, sexually. This was one of the relationships that would define my life going forward and that would trigger, and we'll get to that, but triggered almost my fall. So I thankfully ended that relationship. I met my current husband at the gym, who's been my sense of groundedness, support, the first person who's accepted me at every phase of my life. I know he was a gift from God, but even in meeting him, I was still at this place of adrenaline seeking, still dealing with eating disorders. I studied, I went to university and I studied criminology. I was obsessed and fascinated by the criminal mind. And now that I look back at it, it was this effort to understand and make sense of unsafety. The world was not safe. And one way for me to feel safer, maybe to have a little more control, is to make sense of it. If I could understand the criminal mind, why people do bad things, then maybe I would feel safer. Maybe I could fix it. Maybe I could solve it. I studied, I loved studying the criminal mind, criminology, minor in psychology, sociology, and I eventually graduated. And I got a job right away in law enforcement. So it was right in my field. And again, looking back, I know that this served a survival need. Getting into law enforcement, becoming an officer, having this position of power and authority allowed me to feel safer. And I adopted this identity of power. So now I felt a little safer. And it was so interesting because I really moved up the ladder, this polyvagal ladder, and I could see I was more in a fight state as I was in this position, this career. So I was very easily angered. That was my first go to. Prior to that, it was more of the sympathetic state, really anxious, really afraid, always on edge. But I'm at this point, I felt like, "Oh, okay, you know what? I'm powerful. Now I can express anger," which was kind of this first permission to do that. But I never exposed or shared my vulnerability. You would never catch me crying. I would never talk about emotions. I would be pushing through, working like a shift work and not sleeping well and going out and partying with all the other officers. And never really honoring my body, its needs, never resting. What was that? Gym 7 days a week, caffeine, barely any sleep, and traveling, going sometimes 48 hours without sleep. And all of this had more of an impact on this survival, on this response in my body. So, on a particular travel with work, I was in Southeast Asia. And I had an experience where I felt very, very unwell. Like I had fever. I was just really, really unwell. I felt disoriented. Something was really off. But I just popped some over the counter stuff, flew back home, and went right back into work. I'd just gotten engaged with my husband at the time. We just purchased a house. I didn't have time to slow down. No, of course not. But I kept getting worse. And so I remember coming back from that trip and going to the emergency room because I couldn't breathe. I had trouble breathing. It was really, really labored. I'd never experienced anything like this before. And they just told me, you have anxiety. You just got engaged, just bought a house. Like, that's what's going on. Here, take these anxiety meds. And so I left it at that. But then things progressed. I started getting other signs, GI stuff. I mean, I was on the toilet sometimes 14 to 16 times a day. So my stomach was all off. Again, they told me, oh, it's just IBS. I developed severe anemia. I remember my iron levels at like a 4 or 5. Like it was really, really dire. And I had severe debilitating vertigo. So all of these things, all of these symptoms that I never had before, just overcoming me. And I was calling in sick all the time. I would keep going to the hospital. They just kept saying, it's anxiety, it's anxiety. And I had no answers. And so here I am trying to work and exhausting all of my sick leave. I had nothing left. I was getting in trouble with my managers. I couldn't really share what I was experiencing. No one would even take me seriously. And I went to so many doctors and they all just dismissed me. It's anxiety. It's because of your wedding. That was their answer. When I finally saw a neurologist for the vestibular stuff, I had a long talk with him, and this was a God moment. He asked, where were you before all of this happened? Where were you? Did you experience anything like this? All came on suddenly. What happened? And I told him I traveled to Southeast Asia. And he said, how has no one ever tested you for like a parasite? So he was convinced. He's like, this is not normal. There is something inside you. And so he referred me to the tropical diseases unit. He got me in right away and they listened and they sat down with me. And I remember her saying, we're going to find this. You're in the right place. And there was this relief that came. So she sent all my blood to the CDC in Atlanta, Georgia. And it took time for all of this processing to happen. And on one occasion, I had become so weak from going to the bathroom and from having so much GI stuff that I had a syncope episode where I lost consciousness and I smacked my head on the tub and my face went right into the marble floors. And I received 7 stitches right before my wedding, just a couple months before it. And so that was another thing that I grieved at that moment. I couldn't believe where I was at. So I was placed on multiple medications to manage symptoms. The symptoms never fully went away, but to make me, I guess, to help me get through the day, let's put it that way. And I tried to go back to work on accommodation. And I remember being there and just the room was spinning and I'm sitting at the computer and I'm trying to do this work. And I get a call from the tropical diseases unit. And she says, Vanessa, are you sitting down? And I said, I will. I'll sit down for you. And she goes, you have to promise me one thing. You will not Google this diagnosis. And obviously that brought fear into my body. I'm like, oh God. And she tells me that they found multiple parasites, one of which I needed to get downtown right away and start chemotherapy for. She gave me the name. I wrote it down and I didn't Google it. I didn't Google it until probably a year later. And I found out with this particular parasite that when it enters your body, it pokes holes into your lungs. So that's why I wasn't able to breathe after that trip. Then it gets into your digestive tract, multiplies, hence all of the GI stuff. And then it can also travel to your brain and cause inflammation. So it all made sense. And I was so happy at that point, for her to say, come down here, we're going to treat it, we're going to kill it. And at the time, the medication they needed wasn't even available in Canada. So we had to fight the system to be able to get it from the US. And about a month before my wedding, 6 weeks before my wedding, I started chemotherapy treatment for this parasite. And I remember her telling me in the office, you may lose your hair. You're going to be really unwell. If you want to cancel your wedding, I would consider it. And at that point, we had just put, thousands of dollars down on this deposit. We had people flying in from Greece, and we made that decision to not cancel. Now, at the same time, around this same time, we had another traumatic loss in our family, which shook all of us to the core. More unsafety, more tragedy, more fear. And so all of this building up within me, creating a storm upon storm upon storm. The wedding came. I thankfully didn't lose my hair. I had all my hair for my wedding. I was really unwell. You could see it in my eyes and my face, no matter how much makeup I put on for that day. It was a struggle. I remember being up on that altar on the verge of passing out. We actually couldn't even finish the entire ceremony as the Greek Orthodox tradition requires because I was so unwell. We went to the banquet hall after and we had 400 people there. So massive Greek wedding. And I spent the majority of my wedding night in the bridal suite throwing up from all of the remnants of the medication. And that was a massive loss, massive loss. I remember waking up the next morning thinking it was just a dream, thinking that it was a nightmare. And then seeing my wedding dress on the floor, the pins still in my hair, and thinking, I just missed was what could have been one of the most happiest days of my life. It shattered me. It brought me into more depression. And although I had treated the parasite at this point, there was still the potential that it could come back. Sometimes it could lay dormant and reawaken. And my symptoms never got better. In fact, everything got worse. I started to accumulate multiple diagnoses post-infection, post-treatment. This is the depression, the chronic fatigue, pain, all of those things started to arise in me. And I suffered a very bad concussion just after my wedding, another concussion, which added to all of the symptoms. And eventually, now this is again a God moment because I conceived our baby girl at the age of 27 and was able to carry her and give birth to a really beautiful, healthy baby. I struggled with the pregnancy big time, but my daughter was healthy and that's what mattered. I suffered a traumatic labor and ended up staying in the hospital for 2 weeks because of a CFS leak from the epidural and from what I think was my first POTS episode. And my daughter was also in the NICU for a week because of she had some complications when she was born because I went 41 plus weeks. And long story short, she was healthy. She got to go home, but I was still in the hospital. I had my parents help me with everything. My husband, I even had aunts and uncles come over, my in laws, like everyone helped with her. And she was just so, so loved in this world. And I had a very life changing experience as she was just a few months old when I went to the hospital for a migraine and I flatlined actually. So that's my NDE story, which I'll be sharing. But again, more of this experience of survival and death. I had my son a couple years later. And in between this time, I really, really became agoraphobic. I didn't really go places. I would never leave the house with the children. I, was always needing someone nearby. My mom, my dad, someone had to be here, my husband. I never felt safe. And my kids didn't really feel safe with me. Let's be honest here. I was in survival and they were initially wired for survival. It wasn't my fault. I see that now. I know that now. It was all I could access. But it was also the beginning of a journey for them. And I was struggling. Now, during this time, I did attempt to return back to work. I, went to all the doctors. I tried all the different Western medicine. I also went, chiropractor, endocrinologists, gastroenterologists, ENT. I did homeopathy, naturopathy, functional medicine. I tried it all pretty much. And then I went into other less conventional approaches into energy work and, uh, shamanism and healers and past life regression and Reiki and just all of the different things. Again, I was so, so desperate to feel better. And I was baptized Greek Orthodox. And so, although I was baptized and grew up as a Christian Orthodox, I'd never really gone to church regularly, nor had I ever read a Bible or anything like that. And this journey, really struggling, disconnected me even more from religion. And I actually went to the opposite direction into the occult, into New Age. And I'll share more about that in my next video. But again, I returned to work. Some of the things that I tried gave me temporary relief. I was on quite a bit of medication. And as I returned to work to a very, very, very toxic environment, that unsafety started to snowball again. During this time, went back to school and completed postgraduate studies and became a certified bereavement educator. And I studied grief and trauma. There was something that was pulling me towards this world of emotion, of trauma, of grief. And I didn't know what it was, but I knew enough to follow that. And of course, going back to school, postgraduate studies, trying to work, having two little kids, I was pushing through, bypassing my needs again, barely sleeping. I started getting chronic infections, chronic pain. All the migraines were debilitating. I was always sick. And the vestibular stuff, which I had already been dealing with, like I went through it for 8 years. It heightened at this point. Things escalated big time. And I remember at this point, which was really interesting, I was going to a chiropractor for migraines at this time, and he was the first person to ever mention anything mindbody to me. And he recommended the book The Body Keeps the Score. And I remember buying it and I tried to read it, but the fog was so bad I couldn't get through it. But I'll always remember that because that's the book that planted the seed. That was the conversation that planted the seed. So at this point, I was so, just really struggling, but still managing in some ways. And I had picked up my kids from their daycare at one point. And I was stopped at a light. And stopped right beside me was a man from my past, the man who abused me. This was trauma literally looking me in the face. The trauma I had repressed, forgotten about. I'd never even thought about him. I'd never dealt with it. I never faced it. And he was looking me in the face and he recognized me. And he was driving home. And what I found out after the fact is that he moved right into my neighborhood and that his kids were attending my kids' school. I remember pulling over because I could not even breathe at that point. How could I escape? Now I was going to see him every day. So this really, really shut me down. And I eventually, my body just said no more. It said, we're done. I went way down this ladder. There was no escape. And I just completely shut down. I stopped working. I isolated. At this point, the vestibular stuff was so bad. I was just crawling all around my house all the time. If I had to get somewhere, I'd hold on to the walls. I was barely eating. I was in just deep, deep depression with the darkest thoughts. And things just got worse. And at the age of 33 was when I call it, on my deathbed. I was admitted into hospital at this point. I had full-fledged, gastroparesis and unable to feed myself or take care of myself or even go to the bathroom. I needed full-time 24/7 care, and my family was terrified for me. And so they brought me to the hospital, and I was admitted for over a month. I had turned gray at this point. My skin changed color. We had signs of organs failing. We had so many cardiac episodes. I was experiencing hallucinations, multiple infections, especially in the kidneys. I was experiencing severe, severe head pain. I was done. I would cry all day. I would beg God to kill me. This is where I truly met evil, darkness, face to face, the things that I saw and experienced. If you want to know more, I will be sharing more of that, but it really shaped part of my spiritual journey. Now, as I was in the hospital bed, again, by the grace of God, another God moment, my neurologist, the same one that finally listened to me back then with the parasite, he happened to be on the cardiology ward and he saw my name. And so he popped into my room and he saw me and he was astounded. He could not believe how bad I had gotten. And he started to research. He actually connected with some of his colleagues in the US. And I remember he did a poor man's tilt table test for POTS while I was in the hospital. And he says, I think you have POTS. And he's like, I've never seen it firsthand, but he's like, you fit all the criteria. And I was diagnosed with POTS that day and obviously referred to another doctor for the official test. But they started me on some medication, a beta blocker, and this other steroid to help with blood pressure and all of that stuff. But he was, again, this grace of God kind of showed up. He walked into my room and he gave me an answer. And during that time, I had some new diagnoses like the gastroparesis, the POTS syndrome. And I started to Google and I found this YouTube video from Sarah Jackson. And it was her just sharing all these symptoms that she had and how she recovered. And she started talking about this thing called brain retraining in this program called the dynamic neural retraining system. And she talked all about it. And I kind of like researched it at really quickly in my browser. And I saw these testimonials and I was like, this is bullshit. This is snake oil. Vanessa, you really think that you can heal? There's no way. And so I left it, never looked at it again. Now, I became stable enough for mm, to be released in the full-time care of my parents. I was placed on 12 different medications and I was on just a pure liquid diet. I had seen the psychiatrist in house and was placed on psychiatric meds because of their assessment. I was placed on medication for my GI stuff, for my heart, for my blood pressure. I was on a constant antibiotic because of the infections, which wouldn't resolve. I was placed on medication for the severe nausea, and I was placed on, just a whole slew of things. I remember not even being able to keep my medication straight. Like my mom had to organize them all for me so that I knew what to take and when. And I moved in with my mom, and my kids moved in there, and my husband was working. He had to keep working to keep the house. And I was, again, just completely done. I just didn't want to live anymore. I was planning how I would take my life. And it was at this point, again, bedbound, relying on everyone for support. I didn't even want to look at my kids. I remember them even visiting me in the hospital, and I couldn't look at them because I felt so much shame, like I had failed them. And I didn't want them to see me how I was. And I truly believed that everyone would be better off without me. I truly believed this. I, I didn't want to be a burden anymore. Everyone's life was on hold because of me. And these were the thoughts. These were the lies in my head. And my parents were faithful people. They believed, they had a beautiful relationship with God. Maybe they didn't go to church every Sunday, but they prayed. They had that faith. And I remember they sent messages to Greece, to monasteries, to have people do vigils for me and pray for me. And they said, Vanessa, can we please take you to church? They had called the local church and explained my situation. And he said, bring her in so the priest can do a specific prayer for her, a prayer for health. And so they begged me, Vanessa, please come to church with us. We'll take you there and just that's all we're asking. And so I agreed reluctantly. I had no relationship with God at that point. If he even existed, I didn't even want anything to do with him because he was a horrible God. That's what I believed. I'm like, he wasn't a good God. This was an angry God. He was punishing me for something. How did I deserve this? And again, I did this for my parents. They drove me to the church. It was like a regular weekday. Church was completely empty. And if you know what a Greek Orthodox church looks like, it's probably one of the most beautiful places you could possibly be in. Like, glimpse of heaven, that is how I describe it. This massive arch, like this huge dome ceiling with icons. Like, every piece of wall is painted in icons with golden hues and rich colors. And so they carried me into this church, carried me up to the altar, and laid me on the altar. And the priest, who was new there, I'd never met him before, he placed his sash over my head. He covered my head as I was kind of kneeling down on the altar. And he opened his book and he began to read. And it was in ancient Greek. I didn't understand maybe a few words coming out. I remember my dad there, my mom, and the priest, and me in the middle. And as he started to read this prayer, something happened. Now, I wasn't healed that day. I didn't get up and walk and was fully recovered. Although I believe that happens, I know it happens today. It didn't happen for me. I remember my mom, my dad, so emotional. They were crying. I was crying. It was this moment of just surrender. Like I was just done. And this time, though, I surrendered it to him. I remember just saying, you know, you've kept me alive this long. I've had multiple brushes with death, and I'm still here. Clearly, you want me to live. Now show me how to heal. And so as he was praying for me, I always describe this as this moment that I can only describe as a pinhole of light piercing through my darkness. Because that is all I had, is all I knew at that point. Just darkness consumed me, consumed my mind, consumed my thoughts, consumed my heart. And in that moment of surrender, of allowing something, this connection, light burst in. And it was small, but it was enough. And so, with this hope rope that God passed down, I held on. And within a few days, that program I had researched while I was in the hospital showed up on my feed again. And I'm telling you, I had not looked at it or talked about it since that 6 months before. Like there was just no entertaining it. And somehow it showed up. And so I started to read these stories of people who had healed, who had many of the same diagnoses I had. And I purchased the program. I said, okay, this is a sign. I paid the whatever it was, $300, and the DVDs were on their way in the mail. And that was the beginning. Now, I wanted to also just share with you some of the diagnoses that I collected over this decade. And this is not an exhaustive list, but these are the most common ones or relatable ones that you might have yourself. So before I get into explaining this mind body work and how I recovered, I'm going to read off this list. Here are some of the main things. I've not included all 50 diagnoses, but I had adrenal fatigue, agoraphobia, allergies, food sensitivities, anemia, anaphylaxis, anxiety disorder, amenorrhea, asthma, chronic bronchitis, chronic fatigue syndrome. I had a CFS leak, concussion, post-concussion syndrome, depersonalization, depression, derealization. I was actually pre-diabetic. I had Epstein-Barr, dealt with dissociation, glaucoma, hyperthyroidism, hypothyroidism, gastroparesis, GERD, IBS, kidney infections, long COVID, malabsorption, mast cell activation syndrome, Meniere's disease, chronic daily migraine, vestibular migraine, hemiplegic migraine, multiple chemical sensitivity, OCD, pancreatitis, panic disorder, parasites, pericarditis, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome or POTS, post-traumatic stress disorder, vestibular stuff such as triple PD, BPV, seizures, chronic sinusitis, small fiber neuropathy, tension headaches, ulcer, H. pylori, chronic UTI, and chronic urticaria. So these are many of the diagnoses I was given. And I'm only sharing because I get asked, did you have this? If any of those relate to you, yes, I did. So let's circle back to brain retraining and DNRS. Through this program, which took me weeks to get through, I just want to say that I had such severe brain fog that I could not even string sentences together. It was immensely challenging for me. But I purchased this program And I started to slowly go through the videos. And I discovered that at the core of all of this debilitating chronic illness was a brain stuck in survival. I wasn't broken, I was in survival. And this was a revelation for me that I was wired for chronic survival and I can rewire for safety. My brain was misperceiving threat and I could rewire this response. So I began my journey of self-directed neuroplasticity. And this included various things, included visualization, elevating my emotional state and connecting to positive neural chemistry, dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, and endorphins, limiting that stress chemistry, the CAN chemistry of cortisol, adrenaline, norepinephrine as best I could. It involved interrupting my neurology, the patterns, interrupting and then bringing in safety. So wiring, uncoupling the fear associated with whatever it was, the food, the experience, the thought, the emotion, whatever it might be, and wiring something new in. And it required consistency and dedication, but it meant I had the power. I could heal. Like this was a new concept for me. So I started to do this work diligently, and this program started it for me. It did not have all the pieces. And I want to just preface and say that that was just all that was available at that time. Now we have many more options that kind of bring in all the pieces. This was only top down approach, so just focusing on the brain. There was no connection to the body. And there was no connection to emotions or grief or really just, somatic embodiment. So I started to improve. I'll be honest. I started to improve. Just knowing that this was my brain started to uncouple fear from me. I also left all the groups that were in, the chronic illness community where all we did was talk about symptoms. I left and I never went back. I left anything that made me believe that this was my identity and that these were lifelong. And I had to do that because that was only reinforcing this survival response. So as I continued on this journey, I started to, receive more energy. Some of my symptoms started to soften. I had a more positive outlook. And some things started to get worse, which is common and typical. Migraines escalated. They probably became the worst they had ever been. And I started to kind of look into this, like, what is going on? I'm doing this work. Like, I'm safe. I'm safe. I'm safe. Why are these migraines surfacing? And someone recommended this book by Dr. John Sarno, and it was called Healing Back Pain. I found it for free on YouTube. And I was like, well, I don't have back pain. And, someone was like, no, just listen to it and see if it resonates. And so I discovered that underneath chronic pain was repressed emotion. And I had just been doing this program, for a year plus that told you don't feel anything bad. Elevate your emotional state all day, every day, only focused on positive. And so I was inadvertently repressing and causing another storm within of repression. And so no wonder the pain got worse. And so at that point, after reading that or listening to that book and taking notes vigorously, like light bulb moments, I started to journal. I started to get curious about emotion. I downloaded this app called Curable, which was all based on this pain science and Dr. John Sarno's book and Alan Gordon's stuff and all of that. And so this was kind of my beginning into this world of emotional intelligence. And I started to see the pattern. I wouldn't get angry. I would feel pain. I wouldn't express grief. I would feel pain or sensations. And so at the same time, around that time, I also found a coach. I really needed some support. And she was her name was Tiffany. And she was the beginning of dismantling belief systems, which was another core piece of my journey. I had so many stories of survival, so many, and they were running. That unconscious program was constantly running. And it was it was the beginning of, first of all, awareness of the stories and the realization that I had the power to change them. And so together we started to belief work, and then I started to add in some somatic work as well. And so I just kept improving and getting better. I was sharing my journey online. I had people reaching out to me and asking for support and coaching. And that was kind of where, my coaching journey started. But it was this kind of evolution over a few years to get to this place of where I felt like I was living a full life again. And I got so much better that I decided to return to work even. And so I did. I went back to work. On my first day back, the world shut down. Figures, right? It's like I just started feeling well again, and I'm back to my life, and I'm going to live this abundant life. And now the whole world is going to be locked down. And this other fear, threat, real threat, pasted all over the news, all over the world, it's all everybody can talk about, was staring me in the face. And this was another challenge. And so the world shut down and we were in survival again. Now, thankfully, I had the resources I had because they helped me immensely navigate being stuck at home with two children, working and dealing with this widespread fear. Now, we got through most of the pandemic. We purchased a new house. We moved, during the pandemic into this home that was our dream home. Everything was looking up. My coaching started really, really taking off. I just felt so aligned with this work. I felt just so exactly where I was meant to be. And a few months after moving in, we all contracted COVID, a very severe variant. And we had never experienced it before that. And my parents got it as well. Within days, my father was admitted to the hospital and he was intubated. My father was a healthy 62-year-old man, the strongest man I know. He was the person who sat with me at every doctor's appointment. He would rub my feet and be in the hospital rooms with me from morning till night till they kicked him out. He was my advocate. He was safety. And I was so loved. And during this time, he was in a coma and I was battling COVID. I was in and out of the hospital with severe symptoms, double lung pneumonia, pericarditis, and dealing with the fact that we couldn't even see him. We couldn't talk to him. We never got the chance to speak to him before he was intubated. And within about, I think it was just under 2 weeks total, he passed away. And I got to hold his hand. I fought the staff and I raised hell for them to let us come and see him. And I'm so grateful that I did because at least I got to hold his hand one last time. And I know he heard us. I know he was there in spirit. He definitely wasn't in his body. And he even visited me in a dream and continues to visit me in dreams. But that was the most pivotal loss in my life, which started another storm. And so I had just lost my dad, my safety. My world was shaken. We were all shaken. My supports that I would normally lean on were grieving themselves. I was diagnosed with long COVID, and I knew this wasn't long COVID, or I knew what long COVID was, why it had shown up. I knew why I was feeling chronic fatigue and trouble breathing and POTS symptoms and GI stuff and all of that. It was because I was back in survival. And I knew if I brought in the resources again that I would recover. And I did. I consistently started to weave in safety. I focused on cultivating safety in my body, in my mind, bringing in the resources that healed me in the first place. And I recovered fully. Now, the grief is another story. That was the beginning of this grief journey. And although I had studied bereavement in university and I had all of this training, it's a different experience when you're going through it yourself. And so this really sparked for me this drive and passion into the grief work. I read book upon book, podcast after podcast. I took trainings. I became a grief movement guide. I studied somatics and grief in the body and really got into this world of emotion and became so passionate about it. And I found, and what I realized was that grieving was healing. At first, the grief was terrifying to me to go into that place to feel that. I had to slowly, just very, in a kind of in a titrated way, expose myself to little moments of those emotions. And slowly, I started to make room for it. I started to befriend grief. I started to allow it. And I realized I hadn't even grieved the years of chronic illness that I had gone through. I hadn't grieved the relationships I had been to through, the trauma of that. David Kessler, grief expert, he talks about this. He says, although not all grief is traumatic, all trauma has grief. I had bypassed this entire stage of my healing completely. And it was interesting because I had looked back at where I was prior to this perfect storm with my dad, and I thought I had made it. I thought I had arrived. But the healing that came with meeting my emotions, the sensations in my body with grieving, that took me to another level I never would have experienced. So, this is that post traumatic growth we're talking about. And grief was my gateway. It was my gateway to healing and to safety. Grief also allowed me to make room for all the other incredible emotions in my life. I didn't realize it back then, but when I was being selective as to which emotions I would feel, like I would only feel the joy, or I would only feel the happiness, I would only feel the elevated emotions, I was limiting myself from a full human experience. I was actually, you know, by avoiding grief, limiting my joy. And this revelation and understanding only came by meeting grief, by going straight into it. And this was life changing for me. That's why I'm so passionate about this work. We cannot cut out this stage in our healing because it reveals so much more and it leads to the evolution that you didn't even know was possible. So as I began to grieve, and I'm still grieving is lifelong. If the love is there, the grief is there, and that's not a bad thing. Grief is a reminder of the love. It's almost comforting now. I welcome it like a friend because it's a reflection of my dad. And so I was very inspired to create what I needed during that time, which was a safe haven. And that's where my inspiration came for my membership, Haven. I started it as nervous system supports to help those with chronic symptoms and dealing with this survival. And then I launched the second part of it, which was the grief and emotions section, because we cannot bypass that stage. And so I launched Haven, nervous system, and grief. And the membership has been growing so beautifully. I feel so lucky to be guiding people through this inner work, this deep work. to be witnessing their grief, to be that safe haven for them, to give them hope, to help them with their belief systems, to help them see this revelation that, they're not broken. They've just been surviving for so long. And if you're listening right now and you have all those symptoms I mentioned, or even a few of them, you need to know this. You're not broken. You've just been surviving. And what you really need is safety. Cultivating that safety, that's where healing happens. And the resolution of chronic symptoms is the byproduct of safety. And that's what the focus of my work is, bringing people from survival to safety so that they can live the life that God meant for them. And I cannot separate my faith journey from my healing journey. For me, it has been mind, body, and spirit. And that's why in my membership, I also have faith resources, live teachings, and so much more. But all this to say, there were times on my journey where I wanted to give up. I was not an overnight success. As you can see, this took years to get to where I am. It required dedication and consistency. There were days I remember telling my husband, okay, I'm done. I give up. I'm not doing this. It's not working for me. I'm done. And I would throw in the towel and I would just give myself a pity party. And then the next day I would get up and say, okay, you know what? I'll keep going. What if? Just what if? What if it does work? What if it's just around the corner? And you can ask my husband. It happened a lot. And so if you're feeling that, know that that's a normal stage. I didn't start off believing 100%. I'm telling you, I probably had like 1% of belief when I first started. That belief got cultivated. And it got cultivated through witnessing other people's stories. Podcasts like Hope Ropes, like this, like any of the healing podcasts where I could witness someone's journey and imagine that it was possible for me too. Where I could relate to someone with similar symptoms and think, if they can do it, maybe I can. It started with borrowing belief from others until I could hold it for myself. And eventually, belief is contagious, guys. The belief started to grow in me, and I started to trust. And I started to experience the changes. And the changes didn't, like I said, didn't happen so obvious. Like some of the really simple, subtle changes I noticed was being able to smile and like meaning it. Like I smiled today and I meant it. Or a real laugh, not a forced laugh, like a real laugh. Or I remember, just being able to be present, even if it was for just a moment in time. Like, oh, I wasn't, you know, obsessing over my symptoms. I was just here. Even starting to be open to certain music again. Remember that was part of my journey. It's like, oh, like this feels accessible now, or watching something funny and like really enjoying it. Really subtle shifts. Remember even my husband reflecting back to me like, oh, you didn't complain as much today. And it evolved. Safety grew, my physical state changed, my physiology changed. I got stronger. I started to build physical capacity in my body again as someone who was, really strong and had a really great muscle mass, prior to all of this. I got back to it really slowly. It started with like laying on the ground and, using resistance bands. I remember trying to do, a couple yoga poses and that would like be enough. And I gradually started to increase my physical capacity, started to get out. Even the symptoms were there, I would take them with me. I came to a point, and everybody gets this place at a different time, but get to a point where I could say, even if this is here, I'm safe. Even if this sensation, this symptom, this thought, this part, this belief is here, I'm okay. Even if this is here, I can live my life. And so this created, what I talk about in Haven about living as you're healing and healing as you're living. They go together. Healing doesn't take place in a vacuum. We can live our lives even if symptoms are there. And if you're waiting for things to completely dissolve and resolve before you live, you're missing out. And I get it. When you're at that stage where you're fully bedbound, like I was there, I know, I know. But there too, even in that state, even in that place, you can choose to do the things that are aligned with the life you want to live. And when you have a little more capacity, get outside, connect with others, do things that bring you joy that don't even have anything to do with any of this work. Bring in some creativity, like learn a new skill, find a hobby, just start somewhere. And don't don't let the healing be your life. Let the living support your healing. There's nothing so special about me or the probably millions out there who've healed. We just kept showing up. And that's the honest truth. Like, no one regrets dedicating to this work or showing up. People do regret stopping before the miracle happens. So, nothing so special about me that I healed. And there's nothing so special about you that you can't heal. If this story spoke to you, comment below, let me know. Subscribe. I have so much more to share. It's my intention to continue to bring out hope into this community because I know how it feels to be hopeless. I know what it feels like to get those doctor reports, to have the beliefs that healing isn't possible for you. And I also know the power of this work. I've been doing this work for over 6 years now, working one-on-one with clients. And I've worked with thousands at this point. And I have seen incredible, incredible recoveries. And there are some commonalities in the people who recover. And we'll talk about those soon in another video. But the commonalities, again, just to kind of give you a little bit of a breakdown, include consistency, continuing to show up every day and accepting where you're at, the grieving, allowing, believing in something greater than yourself, bringing in supports, allowing joy in your life, and most importantly, living as you heal and healing as you live. Thank you for being here and for allowing me to share my story, for witnessing it, and for holding space.